I am live. I had a few days break. I am continuing with Many Lifetimes, a book written by Joan Marshall Grant and Kelsey, her husband, one of her husbands. She is recounting here in chapter 3 cases which she has encountered and healed. The Supraphysical Body, it's called, and it is Joan speaking. And I ended with a man who was delighted to show myself that I now actually enjoy touching feathers, because he had a trauma in a previous life, and that was the reason why he was paranoid or phobic about any feathers, and they found that out. Although the physical body has no reality except in the immediate present, for today's vision has replaced yesterday's, which has therefore ceased to exist. This law does not apply to earlier versions of its supraphysical component, for these supraphysical components, being immune to the process of death, can maintain an independent identity, so long as the personality provides them with sufficient energy to do so. In practice, it is unusual to find an individual in whom several supraphysicals do not coexist. Multiple supraphysicals can be a valuable asset to the personality, providing it is not only with a wider field of activity, but also facilitating identification with people of different age groups. They allow the personality not only to remember, but actually to experience the sensory awareness with their physical body registered only at an earlier phase of its existence. Using the supraphysical, which developed when one was a child, it is by far the best way of communicating with children. For, except in the strictly three-dimensional sense, one is again feeling as a child feels, and not as a grown-up. A wider application of the same mechanism is also to use the supraphysicals belonging to earlier personality. This makes it much easier to identify with people older than oneself, or who are of a race to which one no longer belongs, or the opposite sex. If these supraphysicals, when not in use, contain only the energy required to maintain their identity, they are comparable to a wardrobe full of clothes, which are available for any appropriate occasion. But if any of them contains an undue amount of energy, which it cannot or will not release, this energy can cause trouble to the rest of the current personality, or to a larger one in the same series. If the body of an adult is receiving its movement orders from a supraphysical created during childhood, the discrepancy in the relative size of these two components may render the individual accident-prone. Instead of moving smoothly together like a well-matched pair of trotting horses, they are as uneasy as Percheron in double harness with a Shetland pony. I had recognized this intuitively on several occasions years before the concept of the supraphysical body had taken shape, and therapy based on this intuition had been successful. The first time I used it was with a boy of 16, who was pathologically clumsy. When he climbed trees, he usually misjudged the distance between one branch and another, or relied on one too fragile to bear his weight. He fell off his bicycle, bumped into furniture, stumbled downstairs, and the crash of breaking plates was a sure sign that he was helping to wash the dishes. I was bringing him home from the doctor's surgery, where he had endured having 6 stitches put into a cut knee, with his usual stoicism, when I had a sudden hunch about the cause of his trouble. While their children were small, his parents were demonstratively affectionate, but the moment they were old enough to go to boarding school at 7, they were expected to be manly. In their terms, manly meant not only being physically tough, but foregoing the warm physical contact, which is such a vital factor in expressing and receiving affection. After dinner that evening he was lying on the sofa in my study, and under the guise of seeking his advice, I embarked on the case history of an imaginary colonel. The colonel's symptoms were seen to be the result of his following the stiff upper lip tradition, which had led to his being incapable of expressing his feelings. By the time I had finished, there was little left of this heroic figure except the medal ribbons on his battle dress. He was shown to be less of a man than a marionette, and he appeared brave only because his imagination had become so parched that he could not believe a bullet would hit him. As the boy was in the throes of his first love affair, I provided the colonel with a wife, who had confided to me that her husband was not only a ghastly bore in public, but even more boring in bed. As I finished, the boy suddenly flung his arms around me and sobbed, but his tears were tears of relief, at realizing that there was nothing in the least juvenile in being lovable and longing to be loved. His clumsiness had been due to his trying to perpetuate the period of his life in which it had been respectable to be hugged. The moment he recognized that to appear unfeeling was not only misguided, but frankly unhealthy, his energy was freed to flow into his current supraphysical, with the result that his coordination improved with astonishing rapidity. He proved this the following morning by washing a collection of fragile antique glass, without chipping any of it, and the next term at school he revealed an unexpected aptitude for cricket and squash rackets. But what pleased him far more than that was that he found he could dance very well, instead of alienating his girlfriends by trampling on their feet. A similar mechanism was at work in another patient. He was exceptionally tall, but despite the fact that he had several times hit his head on low doorways and, even when getting into his own automobile, hard enough to cause severe concussion, at least one painful bang on the forehead was a daily occurrence. I applied salves and sympathy until he suddenly received from me a more brusque form of therapy, which does me no credit, as it was inspired by sheer exasperation. He had offered to take up a child's supper tray, and a couple of minutes later I heard a crash followed by an ominous thud which sent me running upstairs. He had hit his head on the low beam and knocked himself out. I thought at first that he had split his skull, for his head looked a gory mass, which only on further investigation proved to be mainly tomato soup. As I was the only other adult in the house, I dragged him inch by inch along the corridor and heaved him onto his bed. He remained unconscious while I pulled shards of pottery out of his face, applied sticking plaster, and generally cleaned him up. At this point he opened his eyes and said fretfully, "I wish you'd had the sense not to live in a house designed for midgets." I heard variations of this complaint once too often. "It wasn't designed for giants who pretend to be midgets," I retorted. "How many more times must you make a nuisance of yourself before you accept the fact that you are 6'6", not 5 foot high?" "I am not tall," he said indignantly. Then he added, more slowly, "At least I don't feel tall. I suppose I feel about the size I used to be when I was a boy of 14. It took 2 or 3 weeks to unravel why his body image had stuck at this period of his life. But when we had done so, he felt his true size, and so ducked automatically. Although a stuck or outgrown supraphysical can make a nuisance of itself, one which is free and efficient can provide, among other advantages, a most useful means of teaching a skill to the physical component. This I discovered when at the age of 16 I broke the tendons which support the arch of my left foot. The prognosis was gloomy, and I was depressed by having overheard a doctor tell my mother that I should never be able to dance again or play tennis, although I might eventually walk well enough to play golf. This seemed very cold comfort, as I had shown such minimal aptitude after half a dozen lessons that the golf pro had stated that it would be a waste of his time and father's money to give me any further instructions. After some 16 weeks of lying on sofas or being pushed around the garden in an accident bath chair, with the added misery of being unable to play the piano as I had developed a temporary paralysis in my arms through using crutches, I decided that I would try to teach myself to play golf by practicing it in my supraphysical, which in those days I thought as my upstairs body. With the patience of a performing seal learning to balance a ball on its nose, I taught each muscle to play its part in the act. Over and over again I imagined myself playing around the links, which I could visualize as I had often walked around with those of my young men who were keen golfers. At 2 months, both when awake and asleep, I practiced golf assiduously. I now only had to prove that I could repeat the performance on the 3-dimensional level of activity. Fortunately, the Hampshire County Championship was played at Hayling Island that year. The plaster was taken off my foot 4 days before the meeting. I got a friend to enter my name for each event and obtained Mother's permission to go to the clubhouse, on the excuse that I wanted to watch the players driving off. When I advanced onto the first tee, part of my mind was confident that my body would obey the instructions of my supraphysical, and the other part was terrified that when I tried to swing the club, I should miss the ball completely, or even fall down as my left leg collapsed under me. Perhaps because I knew that if I had to follow the ball into the sand dunes, I should be defeated by the heavy going and would be unable to climb in and out of bunkers. I kept the ball meticulously on the fairway. For years afterwards, Father carried in his note case a cutting from a national newspaper. Girl, golf wonder, 16-year-old player carries off 5 awards in Hampshire County Championship. This is one of the reasons why I know that it is exceedingly important to think of one's supraphysical as being in a state of health and efficiency, even when its physical counterpart is suffering from the effects of disease, injury, or age. For the supraphysical should and can have a most beneficent effect on its carapace, as is frequently demonstrated when its influence produces an apparently spontaneous cure after it has received a boost of energy from someone else's supraphysical, the basic principle behind many types of extra-material healing. The supraphysical can suffer the reverse of this benign process, and, if the personality allows it to do so, can become affected by a resonance to ailments and imperfection which properly should not extend beyond the physical body. This is why it's dangerous to personalize one's maladies. One may not be able to cure the body of its rheumatism or its acne, but there's no point in thinking my arthritis or my spots to a degree which may inflict these miseries on the more subtle components of the personality. The desire to cling to youth often defeats its own object, for if too much energy is directed towards maintaining a supraphysical which should have been outmoded, the current one becomes depleted, which results in premature aging. The character is also likely to deteriorate, but its refusal to face reality is no more and no less than a particularly tiresome form of sulk. Such sulks can even be lethal, as I learned when I was a Roman woman of 40. I was still healthy and handsome, but I found it easier to blame the scribes for writing illegibly than to admit that my eyes were less efficient than they used to be, and I had recently lost 3 of my excellent teeth. I might not have minded this so much had I not met a much younger man with whom I fell in love, and whom I contrived to see frequently by appointing him as the household physician. He was dilatory in displaying affection and Each new white hair, each additional wrinkle reminded me that time was running short. So in the hope that he would realize how much he would miss me if I were to die, I staged an elaborate pseudo-suicide. Having caused a marble sarcophagus to be carved, I invited my acquaintances to a farewell banquet, which was considered mildly eccentric, as this was usually done only when the host had decided that honor demanded he should fall on his sword. Having made a splendid valedictory speech, which moved many of the more tipsy guests to tears, I withdrew to prepare myself for the scene, which I confidently expected to be only the prelude to a far more enjoyable act. I arranged myself in a sarcophagus, now filled with warm-scented water and strewn with white rose petals. I remember thinking that after it had served its present purpose, it would make a most elegant bath, and then I summoned my physician. Imperiously I ordered him to open the veins in my wrist and waited for him to implore me to remain alive, so that he could lavish upon me his passionate devotion. But instead he obeyed me implicitly. I could not have been more horrified than had he murdered me in cold blood. Pride would not allow me to tell him to apply tourniquets, so I had to lie there, watching the water turn pink and pinker, and then red. At last I shut my eyes so that he would not see that they were blind with rage. I am exceedingly grateful to him for having had the insight, the compassion, and the moral courage to call my bluff, for he cured me of any temptation again to use this disgusting form of blackmail. But he received the blast of the long-stored fury when I did a spontaneous recall of that episode when drowning in a far more prosaic bath, for the Roman is again a physician called Kelsey. As I have committed suicide through false pride or in a temper at least twice, and have deliberately withdrawn from perfectly adequate bodies on 3 or 4 other occasions, I know there is no question of being hauled before celestial judges for punishment or condemnation. But what, at last in my experience, invariably happens is that the part of the personality which tried to escape from a particular problem reproduces a similar situation as soon as possible after its reincarnation. When the aspect of the personality which deals with concepts has made a scapegoat of its physical body, the supraphysical, which has been put to the trouble of providing a new one, is unlikely to find its other partners congenial. Instead of instinct, intuition, and intellect working smoothly together towards a common goal, they indulge in internecine strife, which can cause all 3 of them considerable trouble, for no matter which is temporarily dormant, they will not be at peace until they choose again to integrate. So it is unrewarding to commit suicide unless the motive is meritorious, or, as exemplified by the Captain Oates walking away into the Arctic blizzard, or the many heroes who have crunched their cyanide capsules rather than risk betraying friends under torture. But I am sure that we should all be prepared to accept full responsibility for expediting our own death when our body is no longer a useful vehicle through which to transmit our personality. We no longer I read the last chapter again. Therefore, I think that everyone should be fully informed of the prognosis of any severe illness, and told the real odds against his making an adequate return to health. It is then for him, and no one else, to choose when and if he is ready to die. If either Dennis or I become crippled to a degree which prevents us giving any further happiness to ourselves or to other people, especially if our condition makes nursing an unsavory task, we hope that someone will have the charity to provide the means by which we can treat our bodies with the same compassion with which we have treated the bodies of aged or ailing dogs and horses, and release them from further discomforts. This is the end of chapter 3, which was written by Joan, and chapter 4 is The Supraphysical in Medicine by Dennis Kelsey.